Hi everyone, and welcome to Legal Cheek and Shearman and Sterling's EU referendum debate. It should be a fascinating evening. Obviously, the polls are on a knife edge. Currently, it looks like the momentum is with the Brexit campaign, but the Remainers maybe have sort of clawed it back a little bit today in the betting anyway. And so I'm Alex Aldridge, publisher of Legal Cheek. And with me are a panel of three Shearman and Sterling partners from the firm's London office. Now, each of them has a different practice area, so they'll be coming at the topic from a sort of slightly different angle. They'll be giving their personal views this evening, not the views of the firm. And I'm going to pass over to them to introduce themselves.
My name's James Webber. I'm an antitrust partner at Shearman. Have been here for 10 years and a partner for 2.
I'm John Adams. I'm a partner in the investment funds team here in London. I've also been at the firm for 10 years.
Evening everyone, I'm Matt Powell. I'm a partner in the M&A team here in London. I actually joined a couple of years ago and made partner last year.
Okay, so we're going to get straight into the questions. So in order to attend this event, you all had to submit 2 questions, some great questions that came through. And so we've summarised them. And what we're going to do is I'm going to put a couple of them to the panel at first to get their views, and then we're going to open it up as soon as possible. So you can ask the questions that you submitted, or you can ask any questions that come up during the course of the discussion. So the first topic that we're going to talk about is sovereignty. So as law students and lawyers, you guys know more about the relationship between EU law and UK law than anyone else. You know that the EU law is, takes precedent over UK law and actually quite a lot of areas. Yet, the lawyers and law students are overwhelmingly in favour of staying in. And we've seen this with surveys that we've conducted. Legal Cheek ran a survey recently of 1,000 lawyers and law students, and it was about 80% pro-Remain. Similarly, we did a Twitter poll today. We had about 200, again, similar figures. So, but it's strange in that sense. As I said, you know the downsides of being in the EU. And so why is it that lawyers are so pro-Remain? James?
Well, I would say, and it'll become immediately obvious which side of the debate I fall down on, I would say it's because lawyers are taught to understand nuance, and lawyers understand that we live in a complex world which is governed by a hierarchy of norms, and that the system of law and the system of rule of law that we all benefit from and that our complex society depends upon in order to function requires a complex interaction between many different legal systems and legal norms of hard law, soft law, guidance, etc. And we see that the European Union fits into that framework in order to deliver a workable legal system across a wider area than just this jurisdiction. I think lawyers also understand that sovereignty is not an absolute, sovereignty is not and has not ever been an absolute concept. Sovereignty exists in a political environment which offers an enormous number of constraints upon freedom of action of member states or of states, and that we're all better off that there are constraints on state action. And so we're comfortable with a complex idea of sovereignty, of a complex system of law which consists of a hierarchy, and therefore we're comfortable with the role that the EU has in that. And we understand it, and you tend to be less afraid of things that you understand. So that would be my reason why lawyers typically are in favour.
Now, John, you're not perhaps quite as in favour as James, your personal view on the referendum. What's your take on that question about lawyers? Because you would maybe fit in that kind of 20% who might be in favour of Brexit.
So I don't disagree with anything James has said. It was all extremely well put and very sensible. I think one reason why lawyers might also be generally in favour of Remain is that as a crew, as a bunch, I think we tend to be fairly conservative with a small c, not afraid of change as much as just being content with what we have and being concerned as to risks, as to what might happen if we take a more radical view. So that would be sort of an additional reason I'd give. And I guess also, the more we sort of move through life, and the more globalised the world becomes, I'm not so sure that many people care so much about sovereignty, sort of philosophically. I think people take a more pragmatic view, which is, have we got the right result for ourselves, for our families, and for the country possibly. But I think people take a more global view generally, and therefore sovereignty, does it matter, really?
What's your reaction to that, Matt?
Again, I probably agree with both of them. I think I sit somewhere in the middle of James and John. I'm very much the Goldilocks or the baby bear of this triumvirate. But I think there are a couple of points that I'd make on that. I think one thing that lawyers recognise is that when somebody says the statement, 59% of all laws come from Brussels, well, we know that, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about directives? Are you talking about regulations? How is that coming down? And we know that there is much more of a sophisticated system for importing commonality or introducing common ground in our legal system. So that would be the first point that I make. And the second is that foreign or outside influences on our legal system are nothing new. If you look at NATO, if you look at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, there are so many different ways in which British law borrows pieces or is influenced and indeed has to abide by external influences that it doesn't, I don't think is we don't see it as a motive that laws might come from elsewhere. And I think the third point as well is that the idea that we vote for an MP and there are all these MPs there, our elected officials, sat there squirreling away and writing these laws themselves. And the reality is you've got just as much control over the Whitehall mandarins as you do over Brussels. So I think there's a little bit more knowledge and familiarity with the arguments on that side on the legal community.
So we had some great questions submitted on the sovereignty theme. It's one of the most popular. Would anyone like to kick off with a sovereignty themed question for the panel? Come on, be brave. You all have your hands up at the end. They're desperate to get a question in. Now's your time. No sovereignty themed question?
Shall I just jump in?
Yeah.
So it's true. It's clearly true that we, as a nation, as a country, we have devolved power in all sorts of places in relation to sea, was it, and NATO, on a fundamental point about mutual defence and actually going to war. You can't get more serious than that in terms of devolving power. But it's fairly discrete, I'd say. I mean, I think if we're making comparisons, what we have at an EU level is of a degree that's wildly different to that. We do have a vast number of laws that are created by the EU. We do have more and more regulations, which, as you know, are directly applicable, and the member states can't put their own bells and whistles on that legislation. So we do have an increasing number of laws that are created by, drafted by, proposed by people that simply aren't elected by us. And that's just, I think, an inescapable truth. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether you care about that from a sovereignty perspective, I guess is a different question. But as a matter of fact, I think it's a different degree that we're talking about here in terms of lawmaking and actually the rules that we as citizens find ourselves subject to when compared with, the principle of mutual defence under NATO, for example.
So I would say that there's a critical distinction between number and quality. So typically as we hear people talk about the sovereignty question, the laws that come from Brussels are discussed in terms of their number, so X percentage or X number, and not their quality. And what I mean by quality is the types of decisions that affect most of us and cause most of us to vote or engage with political life. If you look at the subject matter of the most recent elections, or going back however far you like, talking about crime? What should our approach to crime be? And prisoner rehabilitation? What should our approach be to the correct balance between public spending and taxation? What should be our correct approach towards national infrastructure investment, railways, roads, transport infrastructure and such like? What should be the correct balance between welfare and work? These are all questions which remain exclusively within the competence of Westminster, insofar as excluding the nations, so that Westminster or the devolved nations. Right? These big decisions are all made by the Westminster Parliament or by people inside the UK, and we vote on people who make those decisions. A large number of rules come from outside, but they largely control the operation of the single market, right? Most of which are not politically interesting. Right? I do not want to vote on what the correct standard for sofa foam flammability should be in the UK. And I do not care whether or not the UK and Germany and France have different standards of sofa foam flammability. Right? I think it probably makes sense that everyone doesn't want a sofa to catch fire, and that it would probably make sense for us all to have the same rule on sofa flammability. I don't feel a great loss of sovereignty over the fact that those rules are made jointly with our neighbours in Europe, as a result of, I don't feel a great loss of sovereignty as a result of the fact that that rule is made jointly. So I think when people talk about sovereignty, the real big decisions I think elections are fought and won on are overwhelmingly made in this country, and that will remain the case after this referendum.
One of the other things, just moving on slightly from sovereignty, it's something we might come back to, and this is again something that's a lot of interest in, is consequences. You know, it's what everyone wants to know. It's a graduate recruitment event. You're law students, you want to get a training contract. These are lawyers. What would Brexit mean for law students and lawyers? You know, what would happen? Matt,
Sure. So, well, I think at the macroeconomic level, I mean, there's a lot of doomsayers out there at the moment saying there will be trouble to the economy and 5% drops in GDP and huge holes in our budget. Frankly, I find it, when people put very specific numbers on that, I find that a bit hard to swallow, because the fact is nobody knows exactly what is going to happen. I think the overall consensus would be it will be painful in the short to medium term. And in terms of market conditions at the moment, there are certainly some sectors which are a little bit nervous as a result of that. I think it would be fair to say that the private equity sector has been a little quieter than usual, as people are waiting to see, perhaps a bit more cautious to see which way it goes after the vote on the 23rd. Will have an impact on exchange rates, interest rates, on opportunities, and I think that's making people a bit more cautious on that side. But it hasn't affected every sector. If you're in the oil and gas industry, you know, your product, barrels of oil, is largely done in US dollars, and your sectors, your countries that you're focusing on, don't rely on Britain being a member of the EU to do that. Now, London as a hub for investment into Africa and into other parts of the world is perhaps in the short term not going to be that affected by it, because people will still come to London and they will still look to us for expertise, and our legal expertise don't disappear overnight just because there is difficulty in the economy. But uncertainty always makes people a bit more cautious, and so I think the near term, I think there will be a drop-off in activity, but I don't think it will be across all areas. And ultimately, when people are unsure, they will look to lawyers to guide them through very difficult times. So I think whilst the wider economy will struggle, I don't think the legal community will actually bear too much of a brunt of it.
Let's take a question on this. Yes, gentleman at the front. We're just going to bring a mic up to you. Just 1 second.
Do you understand?
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah, sure.
Everyone has to stand from now on. That's the rule.
And do
I
the
have a
dance.
question. It takes 2 years to exit the EU, according to the treaties. Do you think that the business in the UK and the uncertainty it's going to create about the negotiation, and I expect the EU to make it very hard for the UK to leave and make it very painful? Do you think that you can take that uncertainty and that it won't have a consequence on the EU market and on other people that might decide, like other countries that might decide to leave, and create even more uncertainty on the single market?
My view is that I don't see how it's possible to have a negotiation where the counterparty at best is angry and hurt that you have done what you've done. You have actively harmed their interests in doing what they've done, what you've done, and which may be worse than that. May set off a domino effect, which Donald Tusk and others have started to talk about. How it's possible, right, politically, in that environment, to make a generous and quick offer to the United Kingdom in a Brexit scenario, that might make sense, right? It might make sense because people want to trade, and that surely this would be the sensible and rational thing to do. But these decisions are not made in a vacuum, in a political and emotional vacuum. They're made by human beings who have pressures acting upon them. There are all sorts of policy decisions that this government and governments all over the world would make if they were acting entirely rationally, and don't make for decades. So my view is that it would be extremely difficult for the countries of Europe to make a generous and quick offer to the United Kingdom. Exactly what form that would take would depend on exactly what the UK does when it posts its Article 50 notice, etc., and there's disputes about exactly when that would happen. But a quick and painless 2-year negotiation, I think, is probably the least likely outcome.
I think the world will keep turning, and the City of London will survive. This is not going to end up in a... I think everyone agrees, even the most rampant leavers, or believers as I believe they're called, I think even they accept that there's going to be a sharp shock to the economy. The only question is how sharp that is and how long it goes on. I think the uncertainty that will necessarily persist for so long as an agreement isn't reached, or at least details of the agreement aren't leaked widely, probably will hurt inward investment into the UK, but there are plenty of other areas that will not be as affected or affected at all. On the financial services side, which is so critical to the City of London and more broadly to the UK, clearly we will remain members of the EU, so all of the financial services passports that institutions have in the UK to enable them to sort of trade freely and so on across Europe will carry on, and I don't think anyone would be well advised to be sort of looking to move immediately to Frankfurt or Dublin until at least some of the dust has settled, perhaps some of the anger has subsided, and people can start to think a little bit more rationally and look to see whether, for example, there will be some sort of access to the single market that will be available to the UK going forward, or whether we'll get treated as equivalent, which will give us access anyway and allow the City of London to carry on doing what it's doing. There's an immense pool of quality people in the City of London, and I don't think that's going to change too quickly. I've certainly seen in the past situations where an event has happened, like for example there was this directive called the AIFMD, which everyone hated in the UK because it hurt us more than anyone else, and everyone threatened to move to Switzerland. Almost nobody did. Somebody did, and then they moved back. The world will keep turning. There will be challenges in the short term for sure, but I'm fairly confident that we could ride that out for sure.
I think the key thing to underline as well is that English law as an export for this country has been fantastic, and the central pillars that make it so strong, a long history of precedent, common law system, belief in a decent set of courts and experienced judges, and excellent legal advice in the City of London. None of that's going to change as a result of Brexit. I can't see it affecting English law as an export, and we here do an awful lot of cross-border work, and I would not expect the choice of law to change as a result of that. It would be macroeconomics and deal flow that would be most important.
That's an encouraging message. Let's take another question. We've got one over here. So just no need to stand up. That was my mistake. I missed it. Fine to sit down. Speak nice and loud into the mic.
Hi. When the Lehman Brothers fell, the gradual recruitment took a massive hit in the legal community, in the legal market. How is Shearman Sterling this time around preparing for a massive event which once again might turn around the legal industry?
We are in terms of graduate recruitment. There is a very long lag on decisions. The recruitment model has been decided already, and there are no changes as a result of this, right? And there are no changes anticipated as a result of this either. As we were all talking about tonight, there are a huge number of uncertainties which affect this firm because we're part of the community that makes up the City of London. And inevitably, over the medium to long term, the business's success is tied in part to the City of London, right? But there are no plans to change. The decisions have already been made, and there are no plans to change the recruitment framework.
I hate to kick it right out into the social part away from the economic bit of the debate, but do you think we have a moral duty to stay in the EU? Because being in the EU has allowed many people who may have come from some of the poorest backgrounds in the world to have access to some great opportunities, as well as the fact that it could affect some great contract numbers too down the line. So in that context, do you think we have a moral duty to stay in the EU as well as a nation?
I don't think we have a moral duty to stay in the EU. I'm actually a big fan of the free movement of persons. I'm a big fan of immigration generally. But that said, I don't think we have a moral duty to stay in the EU for that reason. I mean, we could turn this into an ethical discussion, but I mean, if we're talking about us as a nation or us as individual citizens, when we're checking a box on the 23rd, I think, I mean, certainly that's a factor to take into account. But to me, if we had a moral duty to remain in the EU for that reason, then that would effectively supersede everything else, and we have no option but to go for remain. And I think it's a bit more complex than that.
It's interesting because just following it on social media, most of our readers are under 30, and it often is presented as a moral debate among that age group.
Well, I can understand that. Right? I mean, my view is that if you look at this country's history and the role that this country's played in Western Europe, and if you look at the challenges which face the world, you can call it moral, or you could say what is the honourable and correct thing to do. And I think it's quite hard to say that a country like this should turn its back essentially on the principal means of cooperation in Western Europe between states and seek by doing so to undermine that system. I think that by doing so you strengthen the alternatives, right? And the alternatives are largely unattractive. The alternatives can come in from the Middle East or from Russia or China, Donald Trump. The world has got a large number of political alternatives on offer, and most of them appear to me to be less attractive than the European Union. And I think with a country which has had a history, for 200 years of our history, has largely been on the right side of the argument in terms of Western Europe and Western Europe's development, to make a decision now which would actively harm prosperity and cooperation in Western Europe would be a dishonourable thing to do. That's my view.
Let's take another question.
Say you were David Cameron going into that renegotiation, Brussels, wasn't there be something else that you would have liked to have seen him get from that renegotiation? Were you largely happy with the end result of that negotiation process?
Matt, do you want to take this?
Goodness. where to start. I think that the lack of ability to control borders and to control migration in the country has caused a lot of concern, and I don't think Cameron had a clear enough answer for that. Now, I'm a big fan of immigration. I've been an emigrant myself. I worked in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, and I know the positivities that brings. But I think in order for Cameron to have been able to sell Europe, he probably needed a stronger answer on that. Because what has happened as a result is a very emotive issue for a lot of the country has come to the fore and is riding roughshod over a lot of the arguments. And it's drowning out quite a lot of the data and a lot of the facts, and people get very, very emotional about it. And if there had been a stronger position to come back with, to say, don't worry, I've got this, or whatever this might be, or I'm able to control this a little more, people will be less nervous about that. And so I think that might have supported the arguments in the long run, that as it is, because there wasn't a very clear argument. I think that's fallen by the wayside. I also think that Cameron's done a not very good job of articulating what he did negotiate. The 4 key principles that he argued for and has got the backing for have sort of drifted off a bit in the debate, really, and it's now just become about Turkey's going to take over Britain and just nonsense like this. So I think that would have helped control a lot of the emotions that go into the debate.
I mean, I think he was on a hiding to nothing, really, going and attempting to do that. And the reason I say that is, and this goes to the campaigns that have been run generally, both of which I think have been found wanting, to say the least. But it's very difficult for Cameron to do what he did and say, I'm going to go and I've got these red lines, and if I achieve them, then I'll campaign to stay. If I don't achieve them, then all bets are off. Implication. I'll campaign to leave, and then really come back with some very modest achievements, and then almost immediately to flip into this fervent advocate for Europe and constantly telling us how terrible it would be to leave, when he was effectively saying, I'm wavering, and it depends whether or not I can achieve these things which I sort of now have achieved, and then that's flipped me into this other character. And that's not just to say that the Leave campaign hasn't done the same. I mean, obviously, former Mayor of London Boris Johnson was famously wrestling with the decision about whether to campaign to stay or leave, and you wouldn't know it the way that he expresses his beliefs. So I think Cameron was always going to struggle with that one. I don't think anything that he could have brought back which was remotely within the realms of possibility, i.e. unless he came back and said, guess what everybody, we control our borders suddenly, which was never ever going to happen. I don't think anything short of that would have sated the feeling that there is obviously in some parts of the UK right now on that very issue.
It's interesting because there's a story today in one of the newspapers about the idea that Cameron and the Remain camp are going to go back to Brussels and try and do a sort of panicked renegotiation of that, open borders point. Is that at all realistic that they might be able to pull that off?
Well, not between now and next Thursday, no. But it is. Let's assume we wake up to an out on the 24th. There are a very, very wide range of political possibilities. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, and I think probably going back to the war in this country or the abdication crisis. That you don't have anything of this scale in terms of unpredictable sort of political outcomes. And so, without dipping your toe into exactly what would happen and which MPs will do what and confidence votes and all the rest of it, you end up, one possible outcome is that people go back to Europe and say, and to the Germans in particular, and say that we need to do something on freedom of movement, and in some way a revised offer comes back, right, which allows whoever is the Prime Minister at the time to run a second referendum. Right? I mean that's theoretically possible. There is an enormous number of risks with that strategy, right? It was originally Boris Johnson's strategy. That was one of his ideas when he joined the Leave campaign. But if people have voted to leave the European Union, that's the answer on the ballot, right? Not you're making a big assumption that it was freedom of movement. I mean, yes, we can probably say it's a big driving factor, but is it enough to get a revised deal on freedom of movement to go back and have a second referendum? So I think the answer is not between now and next Thursday, but afterwards anything can happen, and maybe that's one of the options.
Let's take another question. We had someone whose hand kept going up over here, but no, we've got plenty. We'll come back to you. This lady in the white top there.
Hi, so going back to freedom of movement, how realistic do you think any further renegotiations in that respect, especially because you said that David Cameron should have done more and should have came back with a stronger deal, but don't you think that this country, I'm not originally from this country would have actually accepted only sort of the complete abolition of freedom of movement, and that would have completely ruined European projects? So what do you think is the alternative in that respect, especially because there are so many lawyers and law firms that come from EU, and how do you think that would have affected law firms as well?
I agree with you. I think it's going to be a matter of context, though. This is all massively hypothetical, but were there to be a leave vote, and then we get around the table and say, come on guys, you've got to give us a better deal on free movement of persons, it's never going to be abolition, because as you point out, that's a fundamental part of the programme. It's take it or leave it. But there could be something else that's offered, but the point is, would that satisfy people in this country that have an issue? Well, it might, when coupled with the situation that you're in at that stage. So that might take some time, during which the economy may have suffered, right, in a fairly bad way in the short term. And people start realising maybe Osborne manages to push through his ridiculous emergency budget, and people suddenly think, oh my goodness, I'm paying more tax, the NHS is getting less money, and now we've got a slightly marginally better deal on free movement of persons, maybe we should think again. So I don't think in and of itself it would be enough, but it's certainly possible that given the prevailing circumstances it might do the trick.
I think that's right. I'd go back on your point there. I mean, I disagreed with David Cameron's entire strategy, right? And I disagree largely with the British government's approach to negotiating these things, and of having red lines, and only being interested in protecting your red lines. You miss out vast areas of policy where you can achieve win-win situations and actually implement positive change for the common good. I also think that ultimately the European Union is going to have to come to a revised settlement to cope with the level of fiscal integration that the Eurozone is going to require if it's to survive, and to facilitate a single market which is larger than the Eurozone. It may also now, with the migration crisis reaching the state it's in, have to agree changes to the freedom of movement rules, which is not just a British demand, but it will become an issue across. We've seen this across Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere as well. So these are not purely British issues. The mistake, in my view, that David Cameron makes, is to present everything as a British, as an adversarial negotiation, British against Europe, rather than trying to perceive and design solutions which are capable of delivering outcomes for the common good.
I mean, just to be clear, so I think all three of us are big proponents of the free movement of people. I think the question is, what would we have liked more from Cameron? I think my point was that I think the chips that he did come back with weren't very well defined, and that I think was a real issue, and it has allowed emotional fervour to come to the fore. And I think there is quite a difference here in that we live in a city like London, which is fantastic for its cosmopolitan nature, and if you live here and you experience the vibrancy, I think it's no surprise that we're all for that. I think it must be recognised that there are communities in the UK that have seen a huge amount of change through immigration and who might not necessarily be comfortable with that. But the way to deal with that, I think, is through education and to give people time to focus on that. And there is a risk that by focusing too much on the London answer to problems, people feel neglected. And I think a lot of the support behind the Brexit campaign is almost a protest vote, even if they don't necessarily believe what they are. It is we reject the London liberal intelligentsia or whoever it may be. And so I think had Cameron come back with a more structured and defined deal, he could sell to the Sun, he could sell to the North East and Wales and the East Midlands, where I'm from. I think that would have helped shut down a lot of the arguments that have now come to the forefront.
One of the things that has come through so far is how complex this is and how much uncertainty is there around. And I was just wondering, how are you dealing with your clients in that respect? What are you advising them when they're coming to see you? Because they must be looking to you guys as experts in this. What are you saying?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, as I mentioned, I'm investment funds, so a lot of my clients are fund managers. And guess what? The City of London has most of the fund managers, so the City of London is critical, and its survival is very important to my clients. That said, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think anyone would be well advised to just panic immediately and think we need to leave and go somewhere else in order to have access to trading throughout Europe, which is important. Don't get me wrong, I can't emphasise that enough. It is very, very important. But we will have a period of time, certainly for fund managers, during which everything will carry on as normal because we're still part of the EU. There might actually be opportunities. We've all read about hedge fund managers wanting to get exit polls, paying independent people to do exit polls so they can try and make some money out of the way that they think the poll's going on the day. So there might be opportunities there. Nothing's going to change fundamentally that quickly for them. And certainly there might be a time to think, another place may be more appropriate for me in my particular circumstance, but that absolutely won't be everyone. And that definitely shouldn't be a step that's taken until we have some idea of how things are going to pan out. Whether that's 12 months, 18 months or whatever into negotiations as to access to the single market in terms of passporting.
I mean, generally speaking, the lag is too strong, right? And the uncertainties are too great to be able, as John says, to be able to advise anyone to change their decisions on the basis of Brexit. So certainly on a competition law, antitrust, which is what I do, it's bolted into the European framework, right? And that won't change the day after on Friday. Right? So there's no immediate change, and the lag in terms of foreign direct investment into the UK and the lag in terms of people's decision making, all means that these things are for sort of decisions to be taken essentially after the referendum result is known, rather than things you can take in anticipation of what the referendum result might be.
Interesting competition laws. Does anyone have a specific competition law question that they'd like to ask? Just one sec for the microphone to come around. And then we've got a second competition law question towards the back, which we'll go to next.
Competition law. I'll mix them with the insolvency and mergers and acquisitions, I would say, and employment as well. But what's going to happen because the majority of the laws in the case been implemented by European Union, the 30 minutes break and the competition law as well, but I could say 50% probably or 40% comes from Europe. And what's going to happen? Will UK actually reject it? Because I don't think they've got enough law, their domestic legislation to cover up what's going to, if they're going to leave. And plus, referring specific to 30 minutes break for employees. it's a good law. Why would they reject it? What would happen with these gaps? How are they going to close them?
Okay, let's just stick with the competition law for now. So James, you indicated that it might be locked in competition law, but then you're saying could there be an overhaul of it? Because there would be no.
The UK is very fond of overhauling its competition laws. It does it about once every sort of 3 years, anyway. It always does it in the framework of the European Treaty. The normative standards come straight out of the European Toolbook, and anyone I know who is involved in competition law policy in the UK is very attached to those substantive rules and thinks that they deliver good welfare outcomes and good policy outcomes. The other feature of European competition law is it has normative force far beyond the borders of the European Union, and has been exported through various modes, but it's been exported to vast numbers of countries throughout the world. It's the dominant form of competition regulation in the world. That won't change. The UK and the UK competition policy population's fondness and belief in those rules won't change. So there's no reason, I think, to believe that there's going to be any sort of break between the European framework of competition law and what the UK does. There will be changes over time, jurisdictional changes to who decides. So presumably, once we leave, the Commission won't decide anymore, right, over cases affecting the UK. The UK will. But that's a jurisdictional change which will come and will need to be drafted from scratch. So there's I can't foresee any substantive change in the rules, and the jurisdictional change in the rules will not really matter very much, in all likelihood.
We have another competition law question. Did that answer your question? Or?
I actually had two questions. Competition law. The first one was on private enforcement.
Yeah.
Because right now the UK is quite a popular forum in terms of ease of enforcing competition law privately.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that would change if the UK were to leave the EU?
I think that depends on what happens to the Brussels regulation, which is essentially the jurisdictional rule that allows us to take jurisdiction over cases, and prevents other courts in Europe, if you're first seized, from taking the same case. It would affect it in that way, but overwhelmingly, as to Matt's point earlier, the reason that private damages actions are brought in London and are not brought in other countries in the European Union, apart from Netherlands and Germany have a lot, but the centre of it is here, is because of the disclosure rules, which are to do with English law, to do with the way in which English judges are quite sophisticated and able to cope with the handling of complex economic evidence, the way in which the Competition Appeal Tribunal has been set up in order to facilitate, and the regime has almost been designed to allow English law to compete for this type of work, and those things aren't going to change. So I would imagine private damages actions the trajectory will be unchanged, I would have thought.
Let's take another question.
I just wanted to know about one of the things that the Brexit campaign always talks about is how the Europe in general is declining, and that other emerging economies are rising. But one of the things we've noticed is that the global economy is really uncertain. Some of the emerging economies we've seen that we thought was going to be leading in growth rates are kind of slowing down, whether it's China, whether economists are saying that it's going to be a hard landing, whether Africa is really suffering because of linking back to China with the super cycle and commodities has been going down. So I just wanted to know, as a law firm, as a business, do you see that Europe is declining, and whether that's going to be in the long term as more economies keep growing, or is it still be a prosperous continent?
Well, I don't think we need to all start buying canned goods and hiding in our basements just yet. I think it's pretty well known that Europe's struggled a little bit late and has stagnated a touch. But taking a step back, just looking at the UK, in terms of international investment that goes into the UK, 47% of that comes from the EU. And we often hear about China is going to the outside. Well, 3% of international investment in the UK comes from China. China isn't even close to competing with how strong our relationship is with the EU. And the reason that the EU is able to continue investing in Britain is not least because it is still prosperous. I mean, you ask your average man in Eritrea where he would rather live, and I'm pretty sure he will give you an answer. So I think it's very easy for the Brexit campaign to say that Europe's days are done, and it's sclerotic seems to be the word that they use, which I find rather distasteful. But ultimately, this is still the epicenter for global business, us and the US. That is the axis, and the BRIC countries were fantastic and grew an awful lot, and then Brazil and Russia and China have all slowed down. I think it's very, very premature to write off the European Union as an economic force, and in fact I think far from it. I think it is still very much the hub, and we should support that by being our side.
So I think it's a mistake for anyone to be referring to the European Union as being past it and suffering so much that we should kick it to the curb and deal with others. But clearly, leaving the EU does not mean kicking the EU to the curb in the sense of doing deals with the EU, inward investment from the EU, or anything else. It just means severing our membership of the EU, and that's all it means. As a law firm, the EU obviously continues to be extremely important to us in terms of the countries within the EU. Equally, Africa is very important to us. Brazil is very important to us. China is very important to us. And we're always focused on emerging countries as much as we are constantly massaging the relationships that we have across Europe. In the same way that any law firm does with individual clients. It's absolutely critical to keep your relationships with your existing clients first rate, and at the same time be looking to obtain other clients. And so it's only natural that both the EU and emerging countries will be very important to the UK and indeed to this firm and other law firms going forward. So I think it's a big mistake for anyone to be thinking we should kick the EU to one side and be proposing that as a reason to leave, and because I just think it's a completely separate concept, from leaving the EU and what it means philosophically.
Another question coming out. Just here.
In your opinion, which industry would suffer the most negative impact if we were to leave the EU?
Well, pollsters. Pollsters.
Yeah. That's a good one because there's so many variables here, including who ends up being Prime Minister. I mean, who ends up leading the country and what that could mean for particular industries as well. But fundamentally, and this is a boring answer, I'm sorry, but it depends on the terms of the negotiated exit. It would be very easy to say that financial services would suffer badly if they simply have no access to the single market going forward, for example. But that entirely depends on the negotiated exit, and I wouldn't expect them to be in that position, to be honest.
Let's just flip it around a second and look at it from a student perspective, because I mean, for you guys coming into the profession now, very stressful, really. I mean, I guess you've gone through these big 2 referendums that could really change the nature of the country, and which would, possibly have a big impact on the early phase of your career. When you 3 were coming into the profession, presumably it was a calmer time. It was more certain. Do you feel sorry for these guys?
But then there was the invention of the motor car, wasn't there? Which changed everything.
Well, I mean, we had the
.com burst, yeah.
bubble burst just as we were about to qualify, so that was an interesting time as well. You may not even know what the .com bubble burst was, but anyway, it was bad. It wasn't quite as bad as the financial crisis we've had recently, but it was a severe recession that we went through, and there are always challenges, but at the same time, stable businesses like law firms always prosper and manage to see those things through, and I'm sure that as law students you will succeed regardless of the prevailing events at the time.
I think that's right, and I think law firms are in a fortunate position of having a number of drivers of demand. You have M&A activity, which is driven by growth and expansionary macroeconomic conditions. You have M&A, which is driven by contractionary economic conditions as people try and restructure and reorganise themselves. You have financings, which work in both directions too. Litigation. John and I work in regulatory spheres, or spheres which are heavily regulated. You often see, as a response to economic crisis and dislocation, governments regulating or changing the way in which they regulate, which also creates fresh areas and increased legal demand. So, I don't think that people should look at uncertain times from the very narrow perspective of a lawyer and necessarily take fright from that. There are opportunities as well as threats.
I agree with that. So I think one of the strengths of working in a firm with a global platform as well means that you're able to capitalise on a greater number of opportunities. So our trainees have opportunities to work in New York, in Singapore, in Abu Dhabi. There are qualification opportunities in many different offices as well. So I think because we are a global firm and we have a global outlook and our clients are global, whilst there might be some uncertainty in the UK and European markets, I think there will still be opportunities worldwide, and we'll be there to provide the legal advice for that.
And just real quick, if there were to be an exit, right, there could actually be, it's one of those situations where people will say, oh, only the lawyers are happy, because there would be an awful lot of work for lawyers to do to help clients navigate through whatever's coming, all the uncertainty, eventually new laws that are passed, how they differ from the existing regimes and so on. So there's speaking purely selfishly, there's an enormous amount of opportunity there for lawyers. I'm not saying that should sway your decision as to whether or not to remain or leave, but all is not bad on that front.
Presumably there would be a huge amount of legal work that would need to be unprecedented levels if we left the EU.
Yes. Yes. To someone else, I think it was your question earlier about what happens with employment law. There's at least, depends exactly how you measure it. I read it the other day, there were 40,000 different pieces of legislation that would have to be considered as to how does the UK wish to import them, replicate them, alter them, abolish them, whatever. Right? You've got that to deal with. You've got negotiating the deal with the EU. Right? And what is that deal going to be, and what does it mean for people participating? You've got negotiating the deals with all of our other trading partners. What does that mean? What does that mean for everyone else who's playing in this market, seeking to go from this market elsewhere? Right? And you've got the internal UK issues around what does the Bank of England do? What does the Treasury do? Right? What type of policy responses, including legal policy responses, is the government going to take, either to compensate for effects caused by Brexit, or because political choices can change and can be different outside the European Union. So the number of things is vast, and they certainly do create opportunities for lawyers to help people understand them.
So in the short term, Brexit could be wonderful. We're almost out of time. We're going to stay within the time limit very strictly. because we want to get our film just right. And so one final question. Who would like to ask that question at the back? Just bringing the mic over.
Hello. You've touched on the .com, and before that we had the exchange rate mechanism exit, and obviously the globalisation of financial markets kind of prop up each other. So do you think we're overblowing this? Do you think we'll survive regardless? We'll prosper regardless? It may take longer. It may even be quicker. It may be opportunities, especially for your sort of clients, fund managers, may actually benefit from a Brexit.
Yes, it's possible. It's very hard to say, but this is a long-term decision that we're being asked to make. There's no suggestion that this is for the short term, and then in 5 years we'll have another referendum and do whatever, or in 10 years or whatever. This is a long-term decision that we're making, and as I say, I think everyone accepts that in the very short term there's going to be a sharp shock. It's just how long that will go on for and how sharp it is. I think the markets have made that pretty obvious. I think we've done have we overblown it? I think only time will tell, but I think it's some of the talk that's come out from the Remain campaign has been quite astonishing, quite unbelievable actually, in terms of predictions as to specifics, how awful things are going to be. As I said earlier, I mentioned it in passing, this emergency budget suggesting that basic rate taxpayers will have 2p extra, 3p on higher rate, and inheritance tax up by 5%, and all of these specifics, less money to invest in this, that, cuts everywhere, austerity goes on forever. That is quite astonishing, and I suspect it's overblown, but I can't sit here and promise it because I don't know. But my sense is that there's going to be short-term pain, but it's a long-term decision that's being taken, and it's very hard for us to put faith in people saying this bad thing's going to happen, that bad thing's going to happen, or indeed this good thing's going to happen, or that, because the truth is nobody in this room and nobody sitting in the government actually, I think, has the foggiest clue how bad things are going to be and for how long. Not a clue.
Well, so you put it as we'll survive regardless, and I think that's undoubtedly true. We will survive. The question is, I think, how much poorer will we be? Right? It's incontrovertible, in my view, that there will be economic costs, right? And potentially quite significant ones. The IMF says it goes from quite bad to very bad, and that's probably a decent enough way to visualise it. The budget, the emergency budget, really responds to the idea that if you permanently reduce the productive capacity of this country, right, by cutting it off or harming the access to its most significant market, and via that market the rest of the markets in the world in which this country depends, and you have a country with a current account deficit of 7%, which is funded by capital inflows to this country who perceive this country to be a good investment destination. Right? If all of that switches round, I think it's quite possible that you could see a permanent loss of this country's productive capacity, and therefore a resulting need to reappraise this country's ability to be able to afford the things it's got used to being able to afford. And so higher taxes and lower public spending seems to me to be an entirely logical choice, logical consequence of voting out, and it seems fair enough that people know that before they make their decision. So I am a.
I raised my eyebrow if you didn't see me.
I think I'd feel a bit more positive about the process if I had more confidence in the leadership of any Leave campaign, or if I had a bit of a greater faith in how the government would look afterwards. Again, I think the bit that gives me greatest concern is the idea that we are going to simultaneously renegotiate around 150, 180 trade agreements, having antagonised 27 of our closest allies, and in the chair batting for us will be Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and Nigel Farage. I leave it to you to decide whether or not that's your chosen representative.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it there. Let's very quickly have a show of hands. So who's for Remain? Hands up. Who's for Leave? Okay, that's great.
Well, not sure that's representative of the entire country, though.
Let's hope it is.
Thanks very much to a brilliant panel. Round of applause.